This is a Founding Media podcast. Welcome to Defense Innovation, from Tanks to Teleportation, a new show where we explore the intersection of technology, business, and national security with the Defense Innovation Unit, part of the U.S. Department of Defense, and key partners in this effort to grow the nation's innovation base. I'm your host, Dan Dillard. Today, on our first episode, we're joined as always by my co-host, Zach Walker, the DIU Texas lead, and national security expert, August Cole. August started his career as a journalist, writing about the economy and defense industries for publications like MarketWatch.com and the Wall Street Journal. Now, he's retired from journalism and spends his time exploring futuristic warfare through storytelling. He is co-author of bestseller Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, and most recently, Burn-In, a novel of real robotic revolution. He's here to help us understand how the Department of Defense is preparing for the future and why what it decides not to do is just as important as what they do. Here are Zach and August to tell us more. Zach, it's great to see you again. And August, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
August, I'm really excited to be introduced to your work. I am a geek when it comes to future type novels, so I've been looking forward to this chat. Could you share with us how you got started down this path as an author where you focused on future warfare through storytelling?
One of the things that I've come to appreciate, I think, in the past decade is what you don't do is as important as what you do. And I left the Wall Street Journal literally 10 years ago this spring to try to figure out how to not write about what had just happened, but what was going to be happening. My initial career in journalism was at MarketWatch.com and the .com boom and throughout the crash and after, really covering the economy, covering a little bit of the defense and aerospace industries, but also seeing up close what it's like to be part of a disruptive company that's trying to take a very institutionalized sector like the news business and upend it, but also seeing the failures, the aspirations, a lot of the ways that people thought the future was going to pan out and were investing accordingly. It had nothing to do with the reality of actual technological implementation in the real world. So I ended up working at the Wall Street Journal in kind of the 2007 timeframe, and I covered the defense industry, which was a great perch to start to get my teeth into context of, say, cybersecurity as we understood it then, looking at a lot of the bigger weapons programs from an affordability perspective, and just doing the beat work of a reporter. And it's really interesting because the role that fiction played in that phase of my writing career was fairly minimal. I read for fun occasionally, but I think I had, like a lot of people in the national security community, a sense that something like fiction wasn't going to help me do my job better. And when I left that to actually write a fictional story about private military contractors, which is a part of the defense sector that, like, the stuff you hear about, you just can't make up. And I thought, well, that would actually be a really interesting, kind of fodder for a narrative, for a novel. And I started to give myself more permission after I quit to read fiction and to kind of rediscover science fiction particularly. And as I did so and started to see, some of the further developments in, offensive cyber and the effects it was having, starting to see some of the ways that warfare itself was changing and allowing me to try to start to look ahead to what would be happening next. That really, I think, culminated in Ghost Fleet in 2015, which was a story of how the U.S. Ends up in a global war with China and Russia. And the thing about that is that was a book I wrote with my Burn-In co-writer, Peter Singer, who's a great collaborator, far smarter than me, and just the kind of person you want to team up with, and has a real nose for a story. And what we both believed was, just in the same way Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising in '86, I think, really shaped the perceptions of what technology could do and not do in the context of a third world war. Clancy really thought the unthinkable and imagined this global conflict. We wanted to do that with Ghost Fleet, but spin it forward and start to take a lot of the baseline assumptions about technology today and apply them in a future context where we felt there was not enough attention being paid to really core assumptions like, will the Chinese military be technologically advanced in the late 2020s? Are we too reliant on very expensive platforms and not focusing enough on software or similar capability? Where are our blind spots? That same ethos is behind our latest book, Burn-In, which is a domestic story. It's an FBI agent who's hunting for a terrorist who's trying to use technology essentially to turn the country against itself. But the twist is this agent is teamed with a robot, and her background as a Marine, as a robot wrangler in the future world that we've built, gives her a very utilitarian look at technology. And so it's a great window with which to look at how AI and robotics are going to start transforming not just these questions of national security, but all the facets of society that we often overlook, but really do need to understand in the defense community.
August, it's really wonderful to have you on the show. We really appreciate it. And when we discussed kicking this off, we named it From Tanks to Teleportation. The idea behind that is future technology is really, it may sound crazy, but it's really not as far away as it may seem. And that's what I love about your books. And with specifically, since current commercial technology can be so much more advanced than what the DoD is currently using, right? That's something that we've had people tell us that they think we're from the future simply because we can bring in technology that, even though it's today's technology, it's just such a step change from what's currently being done. And that's what I really love about your writing. Being a futurist, you can take that technology that we have today or in the very near term and really make it something that's very real. And I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about that intersection of national security and near-term technology.
One of the ways to think about technology, particularly in this context of the future of conflict or just the future of the security environment, is to start to unpack, what's possible and what's not. And the narratives that we've built in these two books have always hewed to a rule which has been pretty simple, but it's important, I think, to have some grounding in technological reality, particularly if you're going to stretch the bounds of, believability when it comes to concepts of operations or other kind of more applied aspects of how you use that stuff. So the cardinal rules in books like Burn-In and Ghost Fleet are that all the technology has to be real or in development. It would have been very interesting to have had, for example, a campaign like we envisioned at the end of Ghost Fleet with teleporting tanks, to use your tagline. But it wouldn't have made the book, I think, as impactful or useful. And it's certainly not to say that you can't write a great story that has kind of physics bending and really fantastical uses of tech that we're familiar with today. But in the context of this useful fiction, or the label I've been giving it, ficient, which is the riff on the human intelligence or signals intelligence, SIGINT, human, the idea that you can create something fictional, have it be applicable in the real world for those in the national security community who are trying to unpack the role of technology. At the same time, when I think about the different ways that technology is going to shape conflict, and also what the U.S. military and intelligence communities are going to be investing in, it is easy to see when our backward-looking biases, cause us to commit large amounts of money, to ways of thinking about the future of war that don't track with the trends that I see out there. And I wouldn't say that I have a perfect vision of the future, or that any one person even does. But I do believe it's important to start really tangibly building those futures to understand whether the priorities we have set today are actually going to do us any good in the future. The value today, for example, of data and information that can be aggregated and collated and used for everything from targeting to shaping operations is only going to grow. And that's not to say that there isn't going to be a place for platforms that are traditionally the domain or purview of a service like the Air Force or the Army. But the software that essentially is making those platforms relevant on the battlefield will be far more important than it ever has been. And to your point about the commercial sector, if it is that in the artificial intelligence domain, particularly in robotics, by extension, that the leading edge of innovation is sourced from non-traditional suppliers, how the government understands its ability to prioritize, how it understands its ability to acquire those systems in a way that actually is useful in its scale. Because, you can say something like, well, mass doesn't matter anymore. We can do things virtually or with cyber warfare. But nonetheless, the enterprise, if you will, in the national security, establishment in the U.S. is so big that we do have to be able to take a good idea and populate it throughout very large communities. And though it is, I think, great to see success in small corners of and highly impactful corners of the national security establishment, like let's say Special Operations Command, what we're also trying to figure out is how does that apply to, I think, big Army? How does that apply to the Air Force in terms of being able to take, for example, a very useful algorithm that helps you sift through information, or finding a way to have systems communicate to one another that can't ordinarily? and doing that not with hardware, but with new software breakthroughs? Or what can we offload onto, cognitively speaking, onto machines so that we can keep up with this very, very fast-paced development of ideas that's going to be shaping the future of conflict?
That's really cool. You mentioned you just launched that book, Burn In. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank
I
you.
ordered my copy yesterday and about a quarter of the way through already. I'm really enjoying it. And as you mentioned, as a teaser, there's an FBI special agent that teams up with a police robot to track down a terrorist. What appeals to me the most is that in this type of literature is the expert research that's done when it blends science fiction and fact. So based on this research, I'm curious about your thoughts on the future when it comes to AI and robots. What are the coolest things that we'll see in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think one of the really interesting aspects of our future with AI and robots is that it's in many ways already here. The recent pandemic the current pandemic that we're trying to cope with has ushered in technological changes in terms of adopting remote work practices, increasing automation in supply chain and distribution, having us really start to assess, how much we need to know about one another in our society and what role AI can play in that, contact tracing, for example. Those are 3 massive trends that if you start to then follow those little, rabbit holes, if you will, into certain areas like, let's say, telemedicine. Telemedicine has gone for very practical reasons through the roof in terms of adoption and usage, because that's the exigency of the situation that we're in. So people in that field are looking at this and realizing that what they had forecast in terms of practices and large hospitals doing this would have taken 10 or 15 years. We're there already. Education is another example. Large universities, small universities, public school systems. My kids' own elementary and high schools are wrestling with the role that the teacher and the physical place, for example, has in the kind of pedagogical relationship between student and faculty and in the larger educational community. In America or in most Western societies, that's a really, really like foundational part of any community. So when technology is starting to affect and impact those relationships and forcing us to reimagine what they're going to be like, I think one of the really big challenges about this future with AI and robotics is being able to allow us to use our imagination so that we are able to have some agency in how these things evolve. So we can start to have a choice in terms of determining how much is too much in terms of automation, or what role do we really want machines to play or not. What is certain, and I think is important and potentially exciting, is the partnership that can start to develop between us as individuals or us collectively and the software algorithms and machines that are going to be increasingly part of everything from factory work to personal transportation. An example would be, I would really be interested in trying to work with an algorithm that could help synthesize and create the sorts of stories that I like to write, because that would be a fascinating writing partner, if you will, to have. Not that I want to replace Pete with a piece of software, but the idea that, you could be more productive, or you might be able to see your work in a new light. Or what if I was able to do visualizations of my written work by working with a machine learning or neural net partner that really change the very nature of how I express my ideas and creatively. And I realize that's a subset of society, or, the economy, in the very, very narrow world that I'm in. But that is, I think, just one example. What I don't want is to have a world in which we haven't asked really fundamental questions about the kinds of roles that we want machines to play. The really elemental notion of what it means to work and have a productive life in America, I think, is certainly going to be one of the big abiding questions that we have to start wrestling with when software starts to allow the possibility of replacing not just the manufacturing jobs, which have been typically those that are discussed as being vulnerable to automation, but work throughout the economy. So a lawyer, a teacher, a physician, all have the potential, particularly as synthetic personalities are starting to develop. Deep fakes today are the nefarious version, but there is an upside to that too, that technology, which is this kind of idea of a synthetic, imagine if Siri were more real than just voice. So we're looking at this new era that we're about to enter, and that has profound implications, of course, for the national security environment. Our all-volunteer force draws from our civilian society. The technology, as Zach said, comes from, in many cases, institutions that are not formally government ones, and increasingly at arm's length from the government. So being able to extend connective tissue, if you will, between all of those different entities and understand how it's going to fit together, not in a siloed way, not just thinking discretely about what is the future of misinformation or what is the future of the autonomous tank or how are we going to crew surface vessels in the 2030s, realizing that all of these are wrapped up in very similar fundamental questions. So I think we have to start by really understanding, are we asking the right questions, and do we have a way to even begin to unpack them?
Really cool.
And a big part of that too is having that imagination that you mentioned earlier. As you said, with the pandemic, we've seen things happen that people didn't even realize was possible, but then now suddenly we've had to do it. We've had to go online, and now we've willed it into existence, which is not unlike what we're trying to do in the Defense Innovation Unit, and specifically for the DoD. Using that imagination, trying to tell the story, make sure that we're asking the right questions. A lot of that is what you refer to as fiction intelligence, which I appreciate the pun on intelligence, but it really is a potential for a completely different source of information and knowledge and synthesis. I'm curious if you could speak a bit more about how you came up with this idea of fiction, maybe some things that you've done across the Department of Defense to help us get a better handle on some of these problems that we're addressing.
Trying to explain whether anything I do has any impact at all is always a big challenge. And so one of the ways that I figured I might be able to do that was by coming up with an acronym, because I know the currency of acronyms in DC is, of course, incredibly important. And it was a little bit tongue in cheek that I initially came up with this ficant notion, but it's actually become a great shorthand for describing the kinds of useful fiction that is rooted in reality and that follows almost like a certain set of rules. If I were to say what makes fiction and what doesn't, some of the attributes, and I think people can debate this, and that's fine too, and come up with their own variations on it. But as I see it, I would like to think that something that fits into that ficant category follows, for example, a rule that the technologies are real or in development, as we've done in our books, that people act in ways that are much like how we act in our normal world, that just being transported into the future doesn't necessarily change the very human elements and aspects to our relationships with one another. People are still afraid. They are still jealous. There is still bureaucracy in the future. Those sorts of unspoken truths, I think, at the human level are important. And then the other rule, too, is that when you're thinking about the way you want the world to work, being able to, at a first order level, understand that probably isn't actually how it's going to happen, and knowing that the fog of war, that there are still mechanical breakdowns in the future, that batteries needed to be charged, that a lot of these elements and annoyances really in today's civilian lives, but also in military operations, are going to be present in the future. There's some great comics strips that were written by Doctrine Man, who does satirical comics about military life, and some of his future-oriented ones are really interesting because there were still burn pits essentially in like the year 3000 in one of his strips, and I think that sort of a bit of humor is actually so cutting and so true, and really important as we start to try to conceive of a very technologized way of war, or a way that even invites more use of robotics and autonomous systems in whatever form, whether they're small swarms or large vessels that go to sea with autonomous systems aboard them as motherships. Nonetheless, there are going to be these truisms that you can look back through and I think use fiction to help touch base with. I mean, reading history is also incredibly useful to understand what's going to happen in the future. If you want to understand, I think, the future of special operations in Europe, reading a lot about the development of British special operations in World War II, which was a fairly rambunctious effort and not very bureaucratically sanctioned, is great fodder in terms of how the Special Boat Service and the Special Air Service evolved at that time, for example. So there is a lot of connections. There are a lot of connections that you can make, I think, intellectually, that allow you to see those worlds, though, through narrative, right? Through character-driven tales that allow us to connect with people who live in these worlds. What are they seeing? What are they smelling? What are they touching? What makes them scared? What are they excited about? And that, to me, allows a much more emotional human connection through storytelling, which is such a great technology. It's so old, it's so effective. And in many ways, it's a better way to approach than the PowerPoint, which is, I think, like 30 years old this year or something. So, there are these other aspects that to the way we communicate today that I think we really do have to pause and ask, not that I would say everyone should essentially analyze and read and write only fiction. It's one tool among many, to be clear. But are there better ways to communicate these ideas, particularly when they are disruptive and don't fit into the world as it actually is, not as we want it to be?
And touching on storytelling, how's your research and your storytelling changed the way you look at the world?
I think it's a great question, and I'm an inveterate researcher, and I love trying to come up with as much confidence and sure footing that I can find when I'm trying to conceive of an idea or a fictional world. And so being able to be very transparent about that with the reader, something that we really experimented with in Ghostly. When we started out writing the novel, we had kind of like 100 pages of notes and concepts and ideas and white papers and links to white papers, et cetera. And what we realized, though, was as we got to the end of the book, was that because we were asking people to kind of bite off a pretty big assumption in that story, we wanted to share the underpinnings for the confidence and that we had in portraying this scenario, even again, as fantastical as it was. So, we at the end of the editing process put the end notes in there. And to give like a writer's or an editor's perspective on this, that's a significant thing because every page in a book has to count. The weight of a book, the size of a book, all go into kind of the larger publishing economic decisions. So if you're saying I want 27 pages, like in Burn In for endnotes, that's either 27 pages less of narrative. Are you sure your story is going to be okay, without that extra bit of pages? And it also, again, is that kind of fundamental question and just goes to manufacturing a paper book. And with Burn In, though, after we saw the credibility that helped give Ghostly, we knew from the start that we were going to have endnotes. And we think that is a really effective way to communicate, but also be able to establish credibility, especially for people who aren't using fiction at work or even reading fiction at all, of which there are a great many folks who just simply don't make time for that. And that's understandable too. But our hope is that we can kind of bridge between those communities. So the amount of research that I do is it's all in the open source world. And it ranges from, good old fashioned Googling, but much of it is also trying to talk to people and understand not even a discrete technical capability, but really cultural or almost very human questions. How would you feel if you had to hop out of your car and had a robot beside you? At what point would you really trust it or not, that it was going to do the right thing or the wrong thing? Being able to draw on my own experiences, for example, and try to imagine what parenting might be like in the total information society that we described in Burn In. How would I be able to conceive of that in a way that felt credible and would allow people to connect with a character that has a primary role in a story, in this case, to essentially hunt somebody down, but is a real person and trying to show that so that we get people to see that the future isn't just about, solving their discrete problem or their issue of the day, but rather they're going to be a panoply of priorities that different people will have, and making them all feel real and important. That authenticity, I think, comes from trying to understand the role that technology plays in that relationship.
And that's a big thing for us as well. So when we do research on a project, it's oftentimes going out to commercial industry because they've oftentimes solved these problems that we have in the DoD. And it's doing the same thing. It's talking about how the problem was solved, getting those user stories, and then going back in the DoD where these colleagues might think it's crazy, right? Again, I said we're told sometimes they think we're from the future. Being able to share those stories of, well, no, this is how it's happening in industry. These are some of the things that could happen in DoD, and just really making that connection for people so that they can visualize it and then get support that way. It's a tremendously useful, I would say, art more so than anything else. Kind of in that vein, you mentioned something on Twitter that I thought was really interesting. You talked about
this could either go really badly or
That's true. That's true. Yeah, and we're not going to flash any tweets on the screen to surprise you, but no, it's about the future of work, right? It's about the pandemic and COVID-19 and everything else. And you mentioned that you think this pandemic will speed that up, right? And that's something that is really interesting concept because, as we mentioned earlier, this technology is here. It's just a matter of how we're using it. And I'm curious if you could speak to how that accelerates the future.
The William Gibson quote, Gibson being the science fiction writer who in the 80s really coined the cyberpunk or coined the term cyberspace and birthed the cyberpunk genre with like Bruce Sterling and others. About, 17, 18 years ago said, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I feel like that every single day today when and especially using social media to kind of ascertain, these little like almost peepholes into other realities and seeing the narratives develop, in that kind of both visual sense, but also almost like the swarming like nature of algorithmic driven social media. We're certainly at this point where these trends that have to do with remote work, remote learning, being forced to, I think, adopt technologies and ways of working that in fact allow us to prevail. I mean, we don't have to be in a studio together right now, right? We can do this. And we all adapted quite quickly to it, which is a marvelous thing. But yet we're also potentially laying the groundwork for permanent shifts. If half of working Americans are effectively out of work, it's like 40 million right now. That is not too dissimilar to some of the estimates that come from groups ranging from, the Oxford study in 2013 and 18 on unemployment from automation, KPMG, others, all kind of are in that 40 to 50% of vulnerable American jobs to automation estimate. So trying to conceive of a society in which those who aren't working right now never went back to work. And there is a real risk that many of the positions that were there pre-coronavirus aren't coming back, depending on the economists you follow. And maybe I'm more sensitive to this because of my background as a business journalist, but I'm acutely aware of what that implies. And also, to see that from the other side, which is how ill-equipped we are right now as a society to deal with that, to really kind of address these fundamental questions about how do we be, I should say, even just a resilient society if we are, going off into the 2020s and 2030s as committing to a national defense strategy, that is going to envision great power conflict as a possibility and prepare for it. It seems equally important that we have to understand where are the vulnerable fault lines at home, and how do we create a society that can weather the sorts of attacks that may be declared or undeclared by an adversary in that great power context, whether it's sweeping cyber vulnerabilities, whether it's a healthcare system that isn't coping with an unexpected, a historic, to be fair, pandemic, and leadership in governments at many levels that are not necessarily set on, I think, trying to use this as a way to come together, and rather than keep people apart for kind of very tactical political gains. I see that in my futurist sense as being very troubling, and yet especially so when this acceleration of technology is pulled forward. There's also a demand signal right now too in robotics and autonomy, because factories and distribution centers have a real imperative to increase their mechanical automation right now, because a robot doesn't get sick. And yes, I know it can break down, and it's vulnerable potentially to hacking, et cetera. But the paradigm in most commercial businesses that are in that sector right now is really trying to resolve, how do you ensure the next time there's a pandemic or some other disruption that you can keep your supply lines open, your facilities moving along. We may see reshoring, right? Companies that are not confident in China's ability to sustainably manufacture in whatever comes next in terms of coronavirus or another situation may bring plants back to the U.S., but those plants will also be heavily automated. They will not be like the plants that politicians promised, 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. So we're at this point where we're starting to see, the increasing capability of mechanical, kind of robotics in the industrial sense. We have everyday AI all around us. It's helping run everything from, calls like this to managing our social media networks and spooling us up and not really calming us down very much. So we're also trying to come to grips with that too, and really slow things down so that we feel like, what, I can figure this out. I can handle that. I don't think there's too many people right now that are in that state of mind, of course, because of a pandemic. But those forces, though, that are at work in business, that are at work in the national security realm too, particularly trying to wrestle with some of the same questions. A nation that has to put its carrier in port because its crew is sick is going to ask fundamental questions about the vulnerability to further biological events or attacks in the future. And the desire to create, for example, in the Navy's sense, less and less crew aboard ships, trying to create more autonomous vehicles on the surface and undersea, I think speak to some of those imperatives. And then again, back to my business journalist hat, there's an economic aspect too. I mean, one of the projects I just did for the NATO Innovation Center or Innovation Hub was looking at essentially NATO in 2040. And the scenario that I played with was that France was the last NATO nation that insisted on having a human fighting force, that the other members in Europe were not willing to sustain or pay for that anymore. And in fact, on moral and ethical grounds, felt that robots were a better sort of option for defending their interests, abroad and being a deterrent. America was the other country too in that scenario that was still insisting on having a human army and at great scale. I think those are really fundamental questions that sound totally bonkers, but when you start actually looking at the trends that you see today, you see pulled forward from coronavirus, they're not actually as far off as you potentially think. Some of it is, again, imagining what's possible and what's not.
Always makes me think of this question of life follows art. And it certainly seems that way when you see movies or other literature that come out a few years later and we're kind of living the situation. What was once in our imagination, we're now experiencing. So I'm curious if whenever you're doing your storytelling or writing, do you ever have the question in your mind, is what if all this turns out to be true?
One of the things I wrestle with is, would I want to live in the world I've created? And this with Burn-In is something I've really wrestled with. Would I want to be in the position that Laura Keegan's husband is in, a white shoe lawyer who lost his job to an algorithm and is struggling to deal with that? Someone who felt like that they did everything right, that they had all of the boxes ticked, and yet society does not essentially have what they felt they were owed. That is incredibly impactful on everything from, their self-esteem and how they relate to others in their immediate family, but also their politics, also what they feel that they then want from society in turn. And so for me, being able to envision worlds that I want to avoid, which is probably more of what I'm doing. I'm not a dystopian, per se. I am somebody who's, I think, fairly optimistic, but I say I do stare into the abyss a lot. I would like to think that if someone, comes across the stories that I've worked on, that it's helped them feel like they can take more responsibility or have agency in determining the future that's ahead, rather than kind of that paralytic response where you're like, "Oh, this is just so bad. Like we're doomed." That's not the response I feel. That's it's almost like irresponsible. But also, it's great to indulge. I don't know if you read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but that book wrecked me because I really felt like there's just nothing you can do in that scenario, but scrounge along until you die and take care of your kids. And I was like, wow, that's a meditation. And I don't know if you've read Lawrence Wright's End of October, which is out now and envisions it's like a prequel to Cormac McCarthy's book. So I would read that with caution because
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but it speaks to this. It speaks to this point though of trying to think about the worlds that we want to live in, and can we describe ones we want to avoid so they don't actually come true. And I probably spend more time like that than I do, in kind of a utopian frame of mind. And it's not, again, out of any kind of self-indulgent, but it's I'd like to be cautionary and have people take away something that makes them think they can make a better future.
Burn-In does talk about one thing that is utopian. You can push a button and beat DC traffic, which if you could bring that would be a true game changer, I think.
Yeah, the traffic is a really fun thing in Burn-In. Well, it's not fun per se, but it's a great way to connect tomorrow to today. And I think too, this is kind of the challenge of, I think to some extent your work too, is that you're trying to talk about technologies today and how they're going to change in the world in the future. So driverless cars are in development and are coming and are going to be the norm, probably within a decade or so. The question is, will we still have traffic, right? Will we still have accidents? What will it like to be in that world where you're not quite in control as much of your mobility, and, personal transportation is such an American, there's so much wrapped up in that, the idea of the open road, et cetera. But yet at the same time, being able to, especially for people who have lived in the DC area, to know that like the Beltway is still going to be a terrible place to drive, even when there's autonomous cars, that just rings true. And gosh, we might be wrong on that. Perhaps it'll be the smoothest flowing, traffic center in the world. But I'm not betting on it, in part because of algorithms, right? In part because of the competition that will be between various platforms and the software that drives them. We know that, there is no one quote unquote AI, right? Like the idea that everybody has their own implementations and value sets and weightings and data that power the software they're using certainly is going to create kind of a much more heterogeneous environment, but yet one that moves at machine speed. And that to me is a really fascinating thing, because this whole, conversation, especially in the national security sense, human on the loop or in the loop, being in the loop is going to be really, really difficult. And I think if cognitively, we don't have some kind of a breakthrough or perhaps even merge more with machines, in part because we're just going to need, kind of like within some of the cyber domain, you need the machine to do its thing without us getting in the way. And that's, I think, certainly going to be the case with traffic in the future, if anything, because of the complexity of those problems to start to solve. There may be something, I think, to that in terms of understanding the future of conflict too.
Yeah, and to double tap on that a bit, the future of conflict, you mentioned NATO 2040, which is fascinating to think in 20 years' time, not necessarily having standing armies. But if we could shift that a bit to maybe 2025, 2028, and particularly in the work that we do in Defense Innovation Unit to try to bring that technology that is here, just not evenly distributed. Could you speak a bit more, maybe in terms of that next 5 or so years, what you think, especially accelerated by COVID-19, what we may be seeing in the national security landscape, and that the U.S. will have to react to?
I think in the next 10 years to even 5 years, you're going to see an uptick in adoption of human machine teaming capabilities, particularly I think in the undersea and naval domain, because we're trying to wrestle with the geography of the Pacific and how to deter China. I think that is going to be an area where, depending on how we prioritize those acquisition programs, because they are in, of course, competition with crewed or human oriented systems. But you're looking at some of the work the Marine Corps is doing and trying to reimagine that fighting force that has a lot more integration with robotic and semi-autonomous systems. I think speaks to the kind of transformation that will become more prevalent throughout. So, small robotic systems that are very useful for the Army, for example, in dense urban areas that can accomplish a lot of the missions that have to do with resupply, maybe casualty evacuation, for example, would be two areas that I would be incredibly interested in part because those are highly dangerous missions. We often use helicopters for them, which are very, very vulnerable already. And yet, if you could come up with alternatives that did not risk human lives to just move material around, like batteries and ammunition and food, that would seem to be a very sensible thing. The other aspect too is whether the contest over hypersonic technology will be really important or not. And I'm not entirely certain that it will, given the other capabilities that are there at a strategic level, and that introducing the kind of potential conventional long range strike that's talked about as a priority, I don't know if that will be as deterrent as we think, because in the way that I think about the kind of scenarios where that's possible, I have a hard time seeing how it might be used against targets, say, in mainland China, without having them take a much more disproportionate response. Given what I know of their doctrine in the open source world, that doesn't seem like it would be a very successful gambit to take. It's one of the issues with the air-sea battle a long time ago, too. In Europe, I'm really interested in the use of small units that are highly integrated with not tanks and armor, but data. Given the density of population in areas like the Baltics and cities being much more of a focus or center of gravity than they might be in other parts of the world, like in the Mideast and in Central Asia and in parts of the Pacific. In Europe, I think the narrative campaign as being not a psychological operations or unconventional warfare, but actually like a larger kind of contest is going to be really important. And that's certainly going to be the domain of AI and machine learning and neural networks. Being able to create the sorts of always on access to information, for example, in a great power contest that is favorable to your side, especially if it's not biased, especially if it's just as it would be, say, pre-bellum, would be a really valuable tool. And yet also some really fundamentals. The flip side of that is just how do you get people across the Atlantic? We don't preposition like we used to. So are there ways to think about how we use autonomous systems to do that? Are there ways to preposition autonomous systems like we once, did battalions of M1 tanks? Or will that cause the sorts of problems that trying to put, Pershing missiles in Germany did during the Cold War? Being able to put a legion of battle bots, in a bunker in Norway or Germany, may be as provocative to the Russians as deploying F-35s, today. We still live in the world we live in as well. So, getting an F-35, for example, or an F-22 to talk still may be a challenge in 2025 or 2028, but that would be a priority, right? I mean, the interoperability question as a field of innovation that's incredibly important and not terribly shiny would, and I know there's progress being made with, offboarding or whatever, but being able to crack those kinds of like really, really important operational questions, I think is critical. To some extent too, I would think also about the threat, the mining in the North Atlantic that would be almost certain in a conflict with Russia, being able to use autonomous systems to solve problems. And if you kind of go back to what you were saying earlier about, talking to people who are solving problems outside of the defense community, certainly that's not a priority per se, but there are other applications that I think can use data in similar ways to, find, identify, and deal with, physical real world things that might be able to help help thwart or stop some of those kinds of threats from being as big as an adversary might want them to be. And I think that's how I kind of conclude that answer, which is like I would think about everything that I want to have come true, everything my adversary wants to have come true, and figure out how they're going to be working to essentially make my best day my worst. It's not a very complex kind of notion, I realize, but I think that fundamental disassembly can really lead you to some interesting technological solutions and potentially point you towards the sort of people who have answers that may not be resident within our traditional companies or institutions in the defense realm.
Well, you touched on about 10 different DIU projects in your response, and so that's inspiring.
So there's a lot of talk about jobs being replaced with AI. I know I've read some places where 40% job loss would be replaced by AI in the next 10 years. What are your thoughts on how we actually prepare for that over the next? 10 years is not a lot of time. So how do we prepare for that as public?
This is perhaps one of the most important questions we have to wrestle with and start dealing with it literally right now, in part because of the economic toll that COVID has had on the American workforce. We're looking at the ability to replace people in fields that I think believed they were immune to automation. This is a robotics and software revolution together. It's not simply a dark factory that has no people in it, but it's going to a primary care appointment and talking to a synthetic personality, even if you're in the doctor's office, if you need to physically go there to be either essentially directed to a certain type of care or not, or maybe you're doing it from your home. The notion that we're going to see the same technological uptake during coronavirus tail off or be reduced, in the next couple of years, I think would be wrong. And that, much of what we're viewing in terms of the remote work practices that are being, established, I wouldn't say perfected, but honed. You're seeing the essentially autonomization of everything from retail, which was already competing, with online, to be lasting and permanent. So the surveys that are out there, and the first ones to kind of shoot the first shot across the bow were out of Oxford University, but many of the major consulting companies are tackling with this too, as they try to prepare companies for this. But your question, I think, is apt because you're talking about how do we prepare society, and being able to understand how we are most vulnerable and what our world might be like if half of our workforce isn't able to work. That is something that is almost an existential kind of crisis that I don't think our system right now is ready for. We're struggling as it is to meet the basic needs of people who want to work and can't because of coronavirus, and that is not, to me, a very hearty indicator that we're going to have the political will to kind of move beyond traditional understandings of the role of work, the role of an individual's worth. And I don't necessarily think we're going to be kind of living in a Sweden, in America, and
right.
The end of the 2020s, but it's not sustainable that we have this much economic and social precarity and enter into a world in which half of the people who want to work are not able to, or maybe even more. And the studies themselves vary. I mean, some will say like I think it was IMF, I think, had even as few as 10% of jobs. Let's say Oxford was at 42 and or 43, and then KPMG is in that same ballpark. But even if there's 10% of working Americans who can't work and want to because their field has been, it's a big number. And these are individual experiences. And this, again, is where I think fiction is really important, because it's one thing to talk about statistics and data, especially when you get into these really core issues that are so fundamental to what it means to be an American. How often have you been to a barbecue and someone said, "So what do you do?" That to me is a really important thing that we have to wrestle with, this existential level. And it's policy around everything from retraining, from ensuring that we have a healthcare system that can be more efficient and keep people well who can't work, even if we have these sorts of pandemics, which will happen again. That's the sort of nightmare scenario if you think about it. The world of burn-in where fewer people are working than want to, are in a situation where they don't have access to healthcare. That's not a too far-fetched of a scenario to imagine based on the world that we're in here in 2020.
Yes, so true. Wow, this has been really incredible. I know I learned a lot today, as I'm sure many of our audience did as well. Thank you, August, for educating us today and taking the time to chat with us.
It was great to be on the show, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with my friends here at DIU.
Thanks, August.
thank you again to August and Zach for joining us today and even giving us a bit of a glimpse into the future. August's work and his books really do help us understand the individual, human impact of shifting to robotic and software solutions in the defense industry. It's been so much fun talking to you. That's it for this installment of Defense Innovation from Tanks to Teleportation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And we'll be back soon with more about the Defense Innovation Unit efforts. Defense Innovation from Tanks to Teleportation is created in partnership between the U.S. Department of Defense and Founding Media. To learn more about the Defense Innovation Unit, please visit the links in our show notes. Thank you as always for listening.